Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for the very first official event for Pocket Universe this afternoon. I'm going to read a couple of poems from the book, and I have a couple of kind of process things I thought I would share. I think it's interesting to think about how a book comes together and how you write a book in the midst of an otherwise very busy life. So I'm going to start by reading two poems, and then I'll talk a little bit about the writing of the poems. So the first poem is titled First Light, and it's after the concept of first light, which is the first image taken with a new telescope. First light. Astronomers tilt the telescope to gaze at distant galaxies, and we can see the early universe in the light that finally finds us. The blue-streaked whirls of hydrogen, the knotted newborn stars. The universe was, for millions of years, full of only the darkest dark, the just-born elements clustering and joining, until all at once, like the bright, quick heat of a good idea or a dividing cell, starlight. And all the heavy atoms that give us this good life formed inside those blazing, short-lived stars. We can only see the places in the universe the light has touched. We have to learn to look the way that one October afternoon, I lay against the crinkling paper of the exam table while the nurse swabbed gel across my belly, and in the night sky of the uterus, on the grayscale screen of a handheld sonogram, we saw it all at once, the striations of muscle and space, the stuttering and blinking, the insistent flicker of a beating heart. So Pocket Universe is, as that poem suggests, and probably as the cover suggests, a book that is in a lot of ways about early motherhood, but it's also about I think family and how we make sense of memories. And it's got a couple of like wild card things in there. One of my neighbors, who's not a poet, mentioned that he had gotten it the other day. And he was like, he's got the thing in it, as in like the movie. And so I thought I would share that poem as well. So babies, but also other things. So this poem is called The Thing, with a little parentheses for 1982, which is the year the movie came out. And it's also the year that I was born. The Thing. In the year I'm trying to be born, Kurt Russell takes a flamethrower to his friends because they've become monsters in the shape of men. Something buried in the tundra 100,000 years heats up, and so the movie starts in ice and ends in burning. Two survivors drinking around a fire while camp burns down behind them. When the year opens, Margaret Thatcher's son disappears in the Sahara and reappears 3 days later. The first computer virus travels via floppy disk. In Utah, a retired dentist receives the first permanent artificial heart and lives into the new year. It's the year my father leaves to hike a New Hampshire mountain and ski down the ungroomed ravine. There's a war and then another war. And photos from the time my mother's hair is short and dark. In another photo, I sleep against my father's chest as he sleeps on the couch. The thing is, there are no pictures of the three of us together, which is how I know my father carries even then his leaving. When the camera leaves them, we can't say for sure which man's the monster in the snow, but we know that they won't live for long. Russell's face is framed by a fur-lined coat, tendrils of snot frozen in his mustache. And when he says, I know I'm me, we can choose if we believe him or we don't. We live then in the small brick ranch, perched on a hill above the steakhouse with a life-size plaster Holstein standing on its roof. Even in those earliest months, I slept alone, belly down on a crib, stacked with hand-stitched quilts, headlights of passing cars streaking across the bedtime walls. So like I said, I wanted to share a little bit of the process of writing this book, in part because this is a book that was written, the early parts of it, really like in my own kind of early years of motherhood and in years that were very busy. I thought I would share kind of the backstory of that. I think that so often we see the result, right? Like we see like, I got my book, like here's the shining, happy ending, and lose track of all of the like hard work and sorrow that went into that. Someone described that to me once as like the years of sad eating, where you're like just kind of working through it. So I wanted to share a little bit of the kind of backstory of writing the book. And so what you see here is some of the kind of messy stuff that went into the early part of it. In the middle column, you can see one of my many, or like a portion of the Word file where I kept all kinds of drafts and things. A lot of these drafts are poems that did not even make it into the book. I wrote probably at least twice as many poems as went in here. So when I think like, oh man, it took me like 6 years probably to write 10,000 words. Like that's why, because I wrote a lot more than that. And then on the right-hand side, you can see this is a snippet of an Evernote file. I use Evernote to keep track of research. And so you can see like some portion of all of the kind of weird things that I was reading and keeping track of. And a lot of what I was doing at that point was just kind of like, here's a weird thing that I've learned. I'm just going to save this article until I can come back for it later. As I was looking through my notebooks, I was realizing I was just doing a lot of saving. Like, this is interesting. Remember that I wanted to write about this. And this first snippet that I'll show here. So this, what you see on the very left, that kind of like handwritten thing, is one of the earliest entries in this notebook, which is the notebook that I used mostly when I was starting to write this book. And so I heard something on the radio and was like, that is interesting and weird. I need to know more about that. And so I wrote it down. And I later did some research and found out kind of like as much as I could. And eventually it turned into this poem that got published in Blackbird. And I'll read in just a minute. That poem, if you look at the time, like I started, the first note was in 2015. And then the poem didn't actually take shape and get published until 2018. So there's a long time in there in between. Okay, and I'll read the poem, which is called The Braided Stream. It's easy to forget when the news shows two smiling children that you're looking at the dead. An actress is found buried in the backyard of her London home, her sons in shallow graves beside her. They spent 3 weeks in the earth before forensics came and raised them up again. A continent away, the killer drinks beer in the sun. On that same continent, cradle of humanity, a cave deep in the earth is found filled with skeletons, proof our ancestors learned to bury their dead. They had no words, no way of saying mother, lover, son, but they carried their loved bodies through a dark lit by torches. They knew the living and the dead could not stay long together. They knew they could not leave their dead beneath the open sky. The bodies found deep inside the earth aren't human, not yet. They have shoulders and hands built for climbing, lower limbs for walking. They touch the earth and it transforms them. And here inside the earth, mandible, ribs, bones of inner ear, the vertebrae of infants thin as thimbles. And here the fossil record falls apart. In London, children's bodies turn to earth. In tabloids, they wear jackets, the fleece hoods framing smiling faces. Their mother had left television to become a teacher. She couldn't keep her children safe. The coroner says he broke their necks, and then he buried them. For tenderness, to give their bodies a safe and quiet home, or just to smooth his flight. When he's found hiding, he tries to ward off capture with a knife and spoon. He won't smile for the cameras, but he won't say he's sorry either. Before we were human, we knew to carry the dead away from the living and place their bodies deep inside a cave named for stars. So one of the things that I really had to think about as I was working on this book was really looking for joy. There's a lot of darkness in this book, as you can probably hear. A lot of the earliest versions of the poem or of the poems in the book really came from my awareness of like how terrifying so much of the world is and how much violence there is, especially against children and women, and which is something I had known obviously my whole life, but after I had my kids, I think I felt like really way more susceptible to that, and like really kind of viscerally very susceptible to that. But I also knew that I wanted the book to also contain this like wonder and joy that was so much also a part of what I felt. So one of the things I was thinking about as I was writing, and then as I was shaping the arc of the collection, was really like consciously building towards that. And so I'll read the poem that's in, I think, the very center of the book. But I wanted to show you also kind of how I wrote it. So a lot of what I wrote, and I share this notebook, was in these like kind of little frantic moments, like, you know, I have 2 extra minutes. I'm in the daycare parking lot. I have 2 minutes before I have to go in and pick up a kid. I was traveling a lot that year. I was in the job market and traveling for my sister's wedding. And so I spent a lot of time in airports. And so this is a poem that I think came out mostly in one go in the airport. Just kind of sat down in it and it grabbed me. So the text that's here, you can see it's all handwritten, is pretty close to the final poem. That very rarely happens for me, but every once in a while, something just grabs me and I have to kind of do it all at once. There's a line at the end of the poem that I'll read in a minute that is about these dinosaurs. And I was trying to remember why I took this picture. I was looking at this last night. I was trying to remember why I took this picture that has no kids in it. And I remember that it looked like my son had put them in timeout. I thought that was very funny. And then you can see this picture on the right-hand side that is my younger son at the moment, and then also the outline of me. And you can see I'm like very pregnant. And so this poem kind of captures that moment of having one baby and thinking about another one too. And I'll read that. This poem is called Naming the World. When he's past a year, then 18 months, and still not speaking, we begin to teach the baby signs, scooping the air in front of us for want, circling a fist over our hearts for please. It's more he uses most, gathering the fingers on each hand together, then touching the fingertips over and over. It's kind of like this. At meals, we ask more cheese or more turkey, more banana or more cracker, holding each item in the air so he can learn to choose, trying to tie the sounds of words to the objects that he wants. The signs go general, and in excitement he signs more and more water in the bath, more blocks, more milk, more dancing. Without a word to stitch it to, the signs sometimes hard to parse. Sometimes it seems it's just a baby way of saying joy. More dogs, more snow, more plastic T-Rex stomping over train tracks. Sitting on the floor with the new baby kicking at my ribs, this wondrous, not quite baby smiling at his trains. Baby, yes, more of this, more of all of it. So I'll just read 2 more poems, and then I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A if folks have questions or want to talk. So one of the things that surprised me in writing this book is how much my mother's mother came into it. Sometimes I think I don't know, she had a lot to say, and she's been gone for a long time now. But she had a lot to say, apparently still, which seems, and I know my mom is here, and there probably are other people watching who knew Jeannie. It seems appropriate. I think she had a lot to say, so she just had more she wanted to tell me. And so she came up a lot in these poems, I think, in part, like thinking through family again and thinking especially about being a mother made me rethink her. So you can see in these pictures, the ones on the left are me at my wedding, and then the ones on the right are my grandmother as a young mother, and I think that's with her oldest daughter, Patsy. But Mom, you can tell me if I'm wrong. So this poem is for my grandmother. On the first night of the afterlife. After the funeral mass, after a meal of beef on wick and Chardonnay, cushioned by the plush carpet at the Bradford Club. Your daughters said you were right then heading to a big date in heaven, as if their daddy had been sitting all those years patiently in suit and tie, waiting to rise and pull out your chair. The love I'd seen was mostly labor. It was on the days you'd go to volunteer at hospice, but first made him a lunch plate and cut off the crusts of turkey on white, arranged the Lay's potato chips in a crescent around the edge, and sealed the whole thing with saran wrap. Had he not learned in heaven how to spread mayonnaise on his own white bread? Your daughters talked about the afterlife like it was the lobby of the only possible restaurant left in town, where the soup was always baked potato, but at least the waitress knew to make a vodka tonic extra lime before you even asked. But in the real sky, planets whirl unseen above us. They move even when for days I forget to think of them. And even before we named Jupiter's 4 Galilean moons, they orbited an enormous and unfriendly planet. Who am I to say what makes a marriage, what laws govern its ellipses? The heavens aren't heaven. I don't think we'll get to live this lucky life again. I hope that on the first night of your next life, there's someone waiting to turn back your covers, to wipe the cold cream gently from your cheek. All right, and I'll read just one more poem, which is the last poem in the book. The title is Dark Matter, which is a reference obviously to dark matter in the universe, but it's also a little bit of a joke about the like bonkers things that people start telling you as soon as you have kids. Like as soon as you're pregnant, everyone wants to tell you like their terrible story about childbirth or how their kid didn't sleep for like 4 years or whatever. So it's a little bit of a joke about that phenomenon. Dark matter. My daughter broke my back in labor. Is the kind of thing women say to you over pink frosted birthday cake above the din of 4-year-olds after you have children. And so while we eat the pizza crust off our children's plates, the mothers commiserate about the shared failings of our postpartum bodies. How in the weeks after birth, hair fell out in clumps that clogged the shower. How even the same pounds sit differently around labor shifted hips. When I was young, I had no idea how many things there were to be bad at. Prompt return of paperwork, patience with automated phone menus, regular bang trims and dental exams. And also the things that actually matter. Breastfeeding, for example, my nipples 3 days after giving birth so cracked and bleeding that even the lactation specialist and her nurse took a startled step back when I unhooked my bra. It is so hard to live inside a body. But as I watched the woman whose daughter broke her back, wipe frosting from the cheeks of the son she gave birth to afterward, my heart is caught by our collective, unbearable luck. And then, as if the simple act of wishing another year of happiness, of eating cake and leaping through the bounce house is too much joy to bear, the children close their eyes and sing. All right, so that is it for the reading. If folks have questions, I think that Sunny can come back and kind of gather our questions and comments together.
Thank you so much. We do have a lot of comments, but I don't want to just sit there and read them to you while you just say, yes, thank you. So we will definitely be taking a look at the comments after the live event. But for questions, our first question here is about timing and our current moment. So as you know, of course, there's so much talk about motherhood online and things like mommy bloggers and mom shaming and all this stuff around motherhood in our current culture. So can you talk a bit about what it was like writing and publishing this book during this time in our culture and how it's so different from any other time and how that sort of affected you?
Such a good question, in part because I think like I started writing this book probably in 2013. So it's actually, I feel like the way that we talk about motherhood online and to some extent in person has like really evolved during that time, at least in my observation. Before I became a mother, I was very sure that I would not write about it because I just thought like, what is there to say? Like babies are just babies. Like what, come on, that's not serious. Like that isn't the work of serious poems. And I, of course, like, I don't know, embarrassed and horrified by that now. But it seemed so clear that was like not the work of real poetry. And so I feel really lucky to be in this moment where I think that people are writing like lots of views of motherhood that are very different and allow for like a really broad range of feelings. One of the things that I was really trying to think about in writing this book, and especially really as like assembling it as a manuscript, was to think about capturing a range of experiences. And so the book is, as you probably can hear, at least in some of those poems, it's personal, but it's also historical. It's also about space. It's also about primates. It's also about human ancestors. And so really like all of the things that help us to think about this really central relationship. And I'll also say during the same time that I was writing this book, I was also editing an anthology that's out very soon with UGA called The Long Devotion. And so in ways that feels like kind of the counterpart, like my poems aren't in that book, but we were really trying, I co-edited it with the poet Emily Perez. We were really trying to gather together a pretty broad range of perspectives. And so that book includes, poems about like birth and pregnancy and breastfeeding alongside like miscarriage and stillbirth and ambivalence and deciding not to have a baby and having an abortion and then having kids get older. And so I think that was really a kind of counterpoint to say like my book could be a little more narrowly about my own experiences. And then here's this other book that thinks way outside of experiences that I've had.
That's so interesting. Thank you. Our next question is from Joanna. It's about your process. Do you always keep a notebook devoted to a specific book when you start it?
Oh, no, I don't think I think about notebooks that way. In part because at least for me, it's also hard to think about when am I starting a book. I mean, I think in some ways I thought I was starting this book before I was. But I do keep a notebook in general. I think that keeping a notebook and like physical writing and handwriting is really important to me. One thing that I started doing more is the practice of, and I'm certainly not the one who invented this, like keeping a notebook in multiple places. Like I like when I go to the gym, I walk there, and I don't take my phone with me. So that really helps me to think. But then sometimes like, I'd be like finishing a spin class and be like, oh, that's what I wanted to say. Like that's what how I was trying to explain something. And it would fly out of my head because I didn't have a way to record it. So I've started just keeping a little notebook there and making sure that I always have my my other notebooks with me. So it's not necessarily that a notebook is attached to a particular project as much as it's really important for me to have a way of recording things. I also do a fair amount of like voice recording if I'm trying to think through something, especially I have a pretty long drive to and from work. And so if I'm in the car and thinking, I'll like stop and do a voice recording, and that can be a way of like preserving that thought while I'm having it, because otherwise things just fly away. I always think I'm going to remember things and I don't. I feel like I have to catch it in that moment or else it's gone.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Melissa. Can you talk a bit more about shaping the arc of the book and how you went about that?
Yeah. So in part because I was like, I'm not writing a book about motherhood. Like this is not a book about babies. It took me a very long time to shape the book because I was trying to do something else. And then once I just was like, oh, this is a book that has a chronological spine, then I could figure out certain poems where they went. So like the book starts, the very first poem ends with my own birth. And then there's the poem that I read first, Light, that's like a kind of first ultrasound. So the book starts with like the first ultrasound for my first son, and it ends, as you heard, with that last poem with like a 5-year-old's birthday party. That's one of the ones I was thinking. There was a period of my life where we spent a lot of time at like bounce house birthday parties, pre-pandemic, obviously. So once I had that, I could kind of lay out, like on the bed, all of the poems there. I could see where there were gaps. There were some things. The poet Elizabeth Ionesco helped me to think about poems. Some kinds of poems are repeated. I think she used the metaphor of like a layer cake, like there are things that you're layering in. So there were poems about my grandmother, for example, like that I kind of layered in. I had to think about the development of those poems since they didn't fit chronologically. But that helped me to figure out kind of where they went. And then as I was trying to say, like, thinking about the tonal variation was really important too, because I did want it to have this arc towards joy. It starts in a pretty dark place, but that's not where it ends, and that's not even within that darkness. That's not all of it. I also really like sections in a book. As a reader and a writer, I really like sections because I feel like it gives you some guidance, and it also gives you an opportunity to like end and then start again. So this is a book that has 4 sections, and they're not necessarily like, you know, this was 6 months or whatever. They're not that neat in that way, but it is a way of saying kind of like, here's the close of one chapter, here's the beginning of another kind of moment or mood or feeling. And the poem that I read, that Naming the World poem, is the first poem in the 3rd section, because I wanted to be like, okay, now we are moving to a kind of new brighter place.
Thank you so much. Our next question is about kind of the lineage of writers writing about their children and childhood. I was thinking about an interview that I read with Alice Notley in the Los Angeles Review of Books, and it was a really interesting interview. And part of it was almost funny because she was talking kind of about how, in her opinion, she was like the first person to have ever really written about her children in this way. And it was really interesting to hear about how she kind of positioned herself in that lineage of authors. So I'm just curious, you talked about kind of not wanting to think of this as a book about your children, about motherhood,
Yeah.
about childbirth. You know, where do you kind of see other writers who have written about this issue in relationship to yourself? Were there certain writers who inspired you, or people that made you think about writing about parenthood or childhood in a way that impacted this project?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. And I feel like it's one of those things that, and this is probably true, a lot of stuff with motherhood, maybe in a way gets like rediscovered every generation, because there are writers like Alice Notley is one, Sharon Olds is another very obvious one, Adrienne Rich, who've written really extensively about motherhood. And often, for heaven's sake, now I can name like half a dozen, like, you know, Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, like it's there, right? I think it didn't always necessarily get like pulled out in the same way. I'm not sure. I don't want to try to theorize about that right now. But I think to some extent also it's one of these things that like each new generation of mothers maybe just discovers, you know, rereads work at a certain point in their life and is like, this was there. I didn't know it was there. I will say, and now I wish I'm in my office on campus. I'm not at home, because at home I would have like my bookshelf of books that I'm drawing on right in front of me. But I will say a couple of the poets that really were important to me early on. Chelsea Rathburn, another LSU poet, her book Still Life with Mother and Knife came out, I think, pretty shortly after I'd started working on this book. And that was really important to me in terms of how it talked about, especially postpartum depression, in a way that was like really frank. She does a great job of using like received form, like some of them are pretty formally kind of tight poems as a way of like constraining these intense feelings. Rachel Zucker, obviously, I feel like is in some ways like the mother of all poet mothers in terms of how she's written about mothering and poetry. I think especially she has 3 sons and her kids are older now, and so she's written about how that's like continued to evolve. Erika Meitner is another poet whose work has been really important to me. And also just whose example as a poet is really important. She's written, and I've talked to her about doing her own work and also raising her kids and like going to writing residencies, still being a person and feeling like that is fine. I am a good mom, and I am, you know, a writer who is taking her work really seriously. So those are a couple that I would name as a starting point, with the asterisk that like any answer like that, like there's, you know, email me later and I'll send you a much longer list because I have so many more.
Right. I'm sure you could write a whole book about the answer to that question.
Oh my God. Yeah. Like, no, I will send you my like bibliography of everyone that I'm thinking about. And honestly, if I were at home, I would like pull it all off the bookshelf, but.
Thank you. Yes. Our next question is about an aspect of the book that a lot of folks that I've talked to have found especially interesting, which is sort of the the body horror element of it, which kind of comes into play anytime you're talking about motherhood or giving birth from a realistic perspective. There's going to be body horror elements, right? So the question is, when you were writing this, did you ever struggle with feelings of like anxiety or almost like grossing yourself out to write about those things or relive those experiences or imagine others having those experiences? Like, how did you grapple with writing about the parts of this that are almost physically painful to read? So I assume they'd also maybe be almost physically painful to write.
Yeah, no, I love that question. I'm laughing because body horror is such a perfect way to put some part of it. I will say for context that I was raised in like an Irish Catholic family, like a lot of emphasis on kind of like being proper and being a lady. Like there are certain words you don't say. My grandmother, apparently continues to still be very important to me. Always, what did she say? A lady doesn't sweat, she perspires. So a lot of like talk about how you talk about the body and what you talk about and what you don't. And so I think in this book, there definitely were moments that were uncomfortable, or I felt like, oh, I'm saying something I'm not supposed to say, or I'm showing something I'm not supposed to show. And that was really important to me to do. I wrote a little craft essay somewhere, I think it's in the Adroit Journal, about writing about like the unsexy female body, like, because it seems in a way like, oh, and there definitely are moments in the first book where I'm kind of like exposing myself, but in a way that feels safer because it's like sexy, right? And that's a more approved mode of showing a female body in public. So I will say at one point I made myself a list, and I think it was after I went to a writers conference, like a workshop conference in particular, and I was sharing these poems, and I think this was 2018. So I've been working on the book. It wasn't done, but I've been working on it for a while, and I felt like pretty confident in a lot of the work. And there was one man at the conference, and we were talking about my work, and we went around in a circle, and he said, well, these poems are sentimental, like, and just kind of stopped. But like everyone, like all these other, like sometimes one man in a room can command a lot of attention. And it was like once he had said that word, that just kind of determined how it was seen. It was very frustrating, very upsetting for me. And also we were talking, actually, no, the poem we were talking about was the poem Dark Matter, the last poem that I read, where I was like, I don't know, it's got birthday cake in it, but it's not, I don't think it's sentimental. And so one of the things that I did coming out of that was to make a list of like all the things that scared me to write about. I made a list of a whole bunch of words that I hadn't used that I thought should be in there. And so some of it was like vernix, colostrum, like all of these kind of like, real bodily words connected to it as a way of saying both like, this is not sentimental. This is in a lot of ways about the body. And then also pushing myself at times to kind of lean into that, to be like, I don't know, there's got to be room for poems that have like some tenderness and maybe even some sentimentality. I mean, and Sarah Vapp is certainly someone who's thought about that a lot, to talk again about poets writing motherhood. She has a book with the name Sentimental in title. But in any case, that was important to me. It was something that I did really consciously. It felt a little scary at moments. That line in the Dark Matter poem about the like going to a lactation specialist, depending on the audience, sometimes people laugh at that if they've had that experience. And sometimes they just kind of look at me like, whoa. So I can always kind of tell like what their own experience has been in terms of how they respond to that moment.
Yeah, I totally get that, especially when you were saying having kind of one person in the room kind of define how everyone else is viewing your book. And we have a comment from Anne in the audience saying, what's wrong with sentimental, right? But there is that bias, I think, especially for women writers, that if you write anything to do with any emotion, then suddenly it's like sentimental chick lit women's writing all of a sudden, and it's not taken as seriously, right?
Yeah, it's not art, right? Like if there's a baby in it, it's automatically not art.
Right, exactly. So it's really awesome to be able to push back against that. And I appreciate that. Our next question is about, we talked a lot about process today. So just in general, could you talk a little bit about your process? Are you a daily writer? Do you have a time that you set aside? Do you have a place where you like to write? I mean, I think this book has made it clear that you have a lot of other things going on in your life other than just writing. So where do you fit that in, and how do you find the time and the space to still create things?
I think I did it years and years ago when I was in graduate school. I did an interview with the poet Beth Bachman, and I asked her a version of that question because I think in part I had gotten so much of the, people tell you have to write every day, you have to, da, da, da. And I forget what her longer answer was, but the short version of the answer was, I don't write every day, I write all the time. That she was not necessarily like sitting down for a long time and writing, but that she was kind of always absorbed in the practice of paying attention and being present to the world and present to her life in a way that makes writing possible. And I think that's what I aspire to, is to kind of always be attuned. And like one of the things I really have been trying to work on in the last couple of years is to make space for my own attention and my own thought in that way. Because it is so possible to have so many things just crowded out. Like I talked about going for walks without my phone, which sounds dumb, but it's so important. I feel like I just need to be able to be kind of like present to my life and to the things that are around me in order to have the space to do writing in the first place. I think also, as I talked a little bit about, like just being receptive to any weird thing that seems interesting and trying to grab that, like here's a piece of something that I heard on the radio, here's a snippet of language, and making sure that I catch that and kind of like collecting those things. I feel like my process has been not necessarily like I always want to think that I can make myself into like a machine, like I can have a regular, like, every day I will produce X amount, but I don't think that's how brains work or people work, and certainly not how creative work works. And so I think I've tended to work more in a process of like collecting, like I am gathering snippets, and then I'm figuring out what to do with it, and trusting that, when I can, I will figure out how to make sense of what I am working on. So I would say like storing and nesting, and then longer periods of making out of those stored snippets.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I believe that is our last question. So we can go ahead and say goodbye.
Perfect. All right. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.